Brits always wonder when they really get into that intense stuff in Parliament and, with Cameron or Tony Blair, whoever it was.
You please take your seats.
It's got to be something.
Welcome back. For those of you who were not here earlier this morning, I'm Peter Schechter. I'm the director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America program. I live in Washington, D.C., and like other Washingtonians, we consider ourselves experts on politics. And every 4 years, we have our own Olympics. No, we don't throw the javelin, and we don't do the 500-meter relay. But we do have this spectacle called the U.S. elections, which is particularly spectacular this time. And so far, this election has taught a lot of us Washingtonians a big lesson in humility. And it's hard to remember, really, when so many of us got so much so wrong so many times. So now Washington and the world, particularly the world here in Mexico, look on with a shaken mixture of amazement and horror, a little bit like driving past an accident. You don't want to look, but you can't keep your eyes off it, as we move from the nomination process to the general election. It's an understatement to say that in particular our neighbors in Mexico and in Canada are trying hard to figure out what is the meaning of this new political landscape. So it's with this newfound humility that I'm going to moderate this panel. If anybody can make predictions, it's the two gentlemen to my left. We're very fortunate to have them.
But we can make predictions.
So Glenn Bolger to my left is the only pollster to be the three-time winner of the Republican Pollster of the Year award from the American Association of Political Consultants, winning the prestigious award for his work in 2002, 2009, and 2012. Glenn has numerous national and statewide candidates and has done many races, including being, at the beginning of his career, being the public opinion head of the National Republican Campaign Committee. Paul Maslin is one of the leading Democratic Party observers of public opinion and one of the leading campaign strategists in our country. He's advised presidential candidates, senators, governors, and numerous political efforts. His firm is located in California, the most electorally active of U.S. states. Paul and Glenn have the unenviable task of making heads or tails for us of what's going on in America. Additionally, we're joined by two leaders who can help us understand the long-term effects of American politics on our closest neighbors. These are experts who've worked both in the public as well as in the private sectors of their respective countries. Raimundo Enriquez, at the end, is a former member of the Baker McKenzie Executive Committee and the previous chairman of the Latin American Regional Council. Raimundo is recognized as one of the leading voices in Mexico for competition, trade, and antitrust issues. Peter MacKay served in the Parliament of Canada for over 18 years and in the ministerial posts in the Canadian government for 9 years when the Conservative Party formed government in 2006. His illustrious career includes Canadian Attorney General, the Minister of Justice, Minister of National Defense, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. I'm lucky to be the moderator of such a great panel, and we're going to have fun up here. I've asked everybody to be very informal. This is a subject which is going to lead to some considerable informality. So I'm going to jump right in and begin and ask Glenn and Paul to sort of set the stage for us. And I guess the question for you is, what an extraordinary election year we've had so far, and it's not nearly over. So countries in the West seem to be I think this was mentioned by a previous panelist, there's a problem of legitimacy, and there's a real worry about where the West is. In Britain, you have Brexit, you have the impeachment in Brazil, you have France's President Hollande at historic single-digit lows, but nowhere is voter dissatisfaction as loud as in the United States, where Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have awoken legions of people to the sense of anger and dissatisfaction of where they are. So what's driving this? What do you see as the fundamental problem in America today that is driving this sense of resentment and anger? Let me begin with you, Glenn.
Sure. I think there's three primary things that help drive that. Number one is the American economy is stuck running in molasses. It is when you look, for example, at the median net worth of American families, we are back to 1992 levels. So we've gone backwards over time in terms of how people felt about their net worth and what their net worth was in 2007. It's not quite. It's a little bit more than half that currently, and so people feel like we're working hard, working two jobs, whatever it is, and yet financially we're not moving forward. The number two thing is a massive loss in trust in American institutions. The only institution that is significantly better perceived now than it was 30 years ago is the American military. Everything else is either standing still or significantly worse, whether it's the press, whether it's Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, big banks, Wall Street, any of those major institutions and others as well, people have lost major amounts of trust in. And then the third is we've just become an increasingly partisan country. The polarization between the left and the right is much more significant than it was 30 years ago, even 20 years ago. Right now, in the Senate, there are no members of the Senate where you have the Republican being more liberal or moderate than the most conservative Democrat. And in the House, there's only 4. Back in the 80s, when Reagan first was elected, for example, and was able to push through his platform, even though the Democrats controlled the House and Senate, you had over 300 members in the House out of 435, where you had that kind of overlap. You have voters themselves are much more ideologically divided, and they're living in areas. They're moving into areas. They're clustering in areas that people agree with them politically. So you have, the red states are very red, and the blue states are very blue, and we're down to just a handful of purple states. So I think those are 3 significant factors.
And just to add to what Glenn said, we've had now, going back to the second term of George W. Bush, we've had pretty much an unbroken period of over a decade where the majority of the American people, and oftentimes a large majority, over 60%, believe that things in America are heading on the wrong track. There's only been brief moments after both of Obama's elections where there was a slight warming of that trend, but generally a very negative public opinion that's going on here. You have the fact that the 2 political parties seem to have nominated 2 people who have the highest negatives of anybody that they could possibly have nominated as somebody in a focus group. The focus groups always get this better than all the rest of us. A real American voter in a focus group I did last week said, why is it that the 2 parties have nominated people the only people that the other one could beat? And that's essentially what's happened. And I would go to a bigger picture question and phenomenon perhaps throughout history if you sort of step back from all of this. It's true that if part of dissatisfaction ends up producing some kind of populist wave in terms of the political reaction, it is true that it has accompanied huge technological changes in our society. It was the railroads and industrialization that led to the original populism at the end of the 19th century. It was the radio that was used by Huey Long and Franklin Roosevelt to rally people in the time of the Depression. It was TV that was used by Joe McCarthy to shine a spotlight on communism and very brilliantly until his demise. And it shouldn't be a surprise that here we are in the digital world where people can just click and point and get instant reactions. That in fact we've now created a political system where there is great disaffection, where there is an opening for a populist message, and along comes one man who's raised $40 million at $27 each for every month for the last 4 months, and another man who's broken every rule about how to wage a campaign, who by the last, and this is 3 weeks ago, so the number's gone up dramatically since, by the last calculation had received over $2 billion in so-called free media or earned media of attention in terms of Donald Trump. It shouldn't be a surprise, I guess, that these are the candidates that seem to be flourishing.
So let me just, before opening up the conversation, so let me ask the question. I mean, there are those people who say that this disaffection is going to open up legions of disaffected voters who have previously not engaged and not voted. And there are others who say that he's 70% unpopular with women, he's 70 or 80% unpopular with African Americans, he's 80% unpopular with Hispanics. What is the route to his victory, and won't he damage the Republican Party over the long term?
Well, I'm going to take this first. Fox News poll out this morning, Donald Trump's ahead for the first time by 3 points in the American presidential election. Coincidentally or not, he's also hired a pollster for the first time, so maybe this is the beginning of the end for Trump. That we'll say his high watermark is when he hired one of us, not Glenn's firm, a different firm. Listen, I think I had about 36 hours where I thought maybe we, the Democrats, might have a walk in the park this year. And then I realized, no, this is too complicated. There are too many things that are afoot here. There's an electorate that's really grappling with what this choice is all about. And Glenn and I can analyze this 10 different ways. But to me, it sort of boils down to two simple factors that are going to play themselves out. The electorate, in all of its forms in 2016, demographically, the Electoral College, sort of the sense of the trend line in America, was clearly moving and is moving still more toward the Democrats, and Trump may not be able to stop or answer that essential surge, and that surge could end up dooming him. On the other hand, this was already set up to be an election where it's very difficult to continue in a third term. It's only happened one time in the last 70 years in the U.S., where the Republicans had inherent advantages of basically being the change party and having the possibility of a message that would, quote, trump any of what the Democrats were able to do. Trump himself, whatever else you want to say about him, can anyone in this room really tell us what Hillary Clinton's message is? And yet everyone knows Donald Trump is saying, make America great again, with a fundamental message about change. And when you're in a change election, in a change electorate, and you're the messenger that is talking about change, you have significant advantages.
When voters are unhappy, as they are right now, turnout goes up. So there's going to be a whole bunch of people voting in this election, I think, that we have not seen vote in a while, even though they were unhappy in 2008, and there was a wrong track mood even in 2012. I think you're going to see higher turnout. But as to your question about the death of the Republican Party, Peter, that has been, both parties have been declared on their deathbeds many, many times. And you look, for example, 1994, Republicans, after losing the presidency in 92, come back, take the House for the first time in 50 years, and take the Senate. And everybody looks at Clinton and says, oh, well, he can't win re-election. Yet he triangulates, wins easily in 1996. And we had a period of divided government where the two sides worked well together because they both wanted to work together. And in 1984, Walter Mondale won Minnesota and the District of Columbia. Donald Trump isn't going to win just two states. And also the Republicans are heavily favored to hold on to the House. The Democrats would need a massive swing, and there's just not that many opportunities for them to take the House. And the Senate is certainly going to be a battleground. The Democrats have certain factors in their favor, but the Republicans also have some opportunities to hold on to states that are difficult because they have such good candidates and well-funded candidates, who are running. Peter referred to, the elections as our Olympics, and he talked about, the javelin throwing, to which Paul whispered to me, well, we do javelin catching in American politics. But the difference is American campaigns don't take steroids, but they do take campaign finance money. And the Republicans are running for the Senate, for re-election in the Senate, have raised a lot of money. So regardless of what happens in November, parties learn from it. You had Bill Clinton come out of, after losing, in 92, after the Democrats lost 3 straight presidential elections and were thought they would never win another presidential election again. So, parties adapt.
Raimundo, let me broaden this out a little bit from a perspective not from America out, but from outside of America in. There are 2 hugely different candidates that are vying for presidency in the world, and with very different visions of U.S. engagement in the world. How does the non-U.S., non-American business community view the candidacies of Clinton and Trump? And beyond the noise and after the rhetoric all dies down, what is the business community in Mexico looking for? What are you watching from and expecting from the next administration?
I think that whatever the result might be, and I certainly defer to the experts, and if they don't know, certainly I don't know what the outcome will be. But whatever the outcome will be, I think that the fundamental premises that we would like to see is the recognition that Mexico is vital for the United States and vice versa. And the reason why I'm saying this is because from that fundamental premise, a lot of things should happen and a lot of things should fall in terms of industrial policy, trade policy, immigration, mobility, the border interaction, and the whole deep, very deep interconnection that both countries have, as we have heard throughout the morning. We went from a silent integration to a very profound, deep, and beneficial, mutually beneficial integration of both countries. And I think that to the extent that that is recognized, to the extent that that creates a healthy and prosperous Mexico, that is in the best interest of the United States. For instance, in terms of capital flows, investors, what do they look for? They look for certain certainty in the long run. Some rules that will stay around in order for them to plan their investments. And to be very honest, in a market scenario, at least from a financial perspective that sometimes resembles a roller coaster at this stage, governments may help in provide some assurance and some medium or long-term prospectus that, to be honest, some of the statements by both candidates appear not to go in that fashion. And to be very honest, sometimes they even defy the rule of law or the logic. And if we remember, or those of us that might remember when Mexico opened its economy and its policies to foreign investment in a more freely manner, the main concern that our clients always raised was that those rules were in certain hidden type of general resolutions, and they were not into the law. So at that time, we really lobbied for Congress to take those measures and allow the investors to plan on a longer range. I think from many of the benefits that NAFTA brought was the fact that it provided credibility to the rules, and to that, and for the investors, that really matters.
So I want to get back to NAFTA in a second, but I want to ask, one of the most interesting juxtapositions in at least the Western Hemisphere's politics is the juxtaposition of Canada's new Prime Minister, who has been getting a lot of attention for a very diverse cabinet, as well as welcoming large numbers of refugees. And this, of course, stands in really stark contrast to the rhetoric in the United States that's going on now. And I'm sure it's not the first time you've encountered a stark contrast between the United States and Canada. But this is, at least in my memory, it really is a huge juxtaposition. And given the forceful personality of Prime Minister Trudeau, you showed me a video yesterday of the Prime Minister sort of actually in Parliament having a bit of a physical tussle with somebody. I mean, do you expect relations to worsen substantially if under a Trump presidency? What do Canadians worry about most?
Well, I think there's almost a big brother or big sister type of relationship that we've always felt in Canada with the United States. We care a great deal about how Americans view us, and many times they don't view us at all. So there's a relationship there that is complex and goes back many, many years. You mentioned sort of the important dynamic between a president and a Canadian Prime Minister. Ironically, there was a very strained relationship between our current Prime Minister, his father, Pierre Trudeau, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. They did not get along. John Diefenbaker and John Kennedy did not get along. However, I would submit that both countries' leaders recognized the importance of that relationship. And it plays itself out in many different ways. We would probably never have signed, or at least not as quickly been able to achieve free trade between Canada and the United States were it not for a very productive relationship between Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney. And the same can be said of other relationships in the past that advanced acid rain treaties, for example, environmental agreements. Those type of personal relationships at the top do matter. And the same is true, I know, of Mexico. And the North American Free Trade Agreement was, again, advanced at a period in time where there seemed to be a simpatico type of relationship that recognized whatever personal feelings may be there, we've got to get past it. To come back to your question, Peter, how do we anticipate this presidential campaign affecting Canada in the longer term? It could go a number of ways, but I think the enduring takeaway from the historical relationship is that we have to get past whatever personal feelings or animosity or comments that have been made. Hillary Clinton, for example, for the longest time made very public comments about the 9/11 bombers having come through Canada. Well, that was simply patently false. It was untrue. And there was a bad feeling that emerged around that subject for a long time. And the secure relationship in North America, what we were able to do and accomplish through NATO, in Afghanistan mission, other areas in which we had profound, deep cooperation, that endures, that gets beyond sometimes the one-offs. But I want to come back to the comment that was made by my friend about sort of a consistency and a predictability.
Yep.
I think that is where a lot of Canadians and commentators and politicians and economists are a bit flummoxed by some of the statements that are coming out of both candidates. Trump in particular, but Hillary as well, pulling back on free trade, talking more in protectionist terms. As we heard from the Mexican Foreign Secretary, the North American Free Trade Agreement, I would suggest, has been the most successful trade relationship on the planet. From a Canadian perspective, along that 4,000-mile border, it has been the lifeblood for our economy. And $1 billion a day goes across at the Ambassador Bridge at one point on our border, $1 billion in trade a day, just to amplify the magnitude of that relationship. I took away something else from the Foreign Secretary's comments this morning, and that is, her reference to bridges. And whatever comes in the outcome of the final election in the United States, there is perhaps an opportunity to strengthen Canada-Mexico relationships. Just as we're looking to the European trade agreement, this comprehensive economic trade agreement with the European Union, there may be a few speed bumps to come because of Brexit, which you touched on, but look, relationships, trade relationships, economic relationships will endure, they will evolve, and I think as a final point, the reality is that whether it's Mr. Trump or Ms. Clinton, there is going to be a lot to be said about abrogating any trade relationships in the House and in the Senate. It's not as simply, stroke of a pen. A president can no longer exercise that kind of authority. In fact, there are more restrictions on a United States president than there are on a Canadian prime minister or a Mexican president. There is a great deal of checks and balances baked in to the American political system.
Let me just push you both a little bit, since you brought up NAFTA. I was going to come to it later, but I think it's worth talking about now. I mean, in Mexico and in Canada, I mean, we heard in the previous panel that there continues to be some serious doubts. I know in America there are too, and we'll get to that in a second. But there continue to be some serious doubts about how has NAFTA really worked in Mexico. Has it really been effective at raising people's incomes? Or in Canada, has it with all the good relations that we have, and yet the Keystone Pipeline did not progress forward? I mean, are there doubts in your countries about NAFTA, or are those doubts only emanating from the United States? Let me begin with you, Raimundo.
No, I think that as it was also explained in any shift of policy, and I think that Mexico decided a long time ago to open its economy, to accept foreign investment more broadly, and certainly insert itself in the globalization of the world, assume certain costs. As the report that was just disclosed last night or this morning, it certainly highlights that, in a sense, there are winners and some losers in this new reality. I think that the challenge is for the political establishments, for the governments, to sort of counter-attack in certain ways those sectors that might not be as benefited as the ones that were successfully inserted in the new era of globalization.
Because there's a loud Mexican voice. Andrés Manuel López Obrador is a loud voice against
Absolutely,
trade.
and I think it's just a reflection in many corners of the world, certainly in the States and in the South Cone, and in some other instances even in Europe. And I think that that is the real culprit, if you say, of those sectors that might not have been benefited. And I think that the fundamental flaw in the speech of the candidates, especially of Mr. Trump, is that very simple, unfounded in my view, culprit that Mexico is the one that is harming the U.S. labor.
I would echo very much what Raimundo has said, and Canada has been, I guess, less on the receiving end of some of the, the rhetoric, but there was a reference to a wall in Canada. That was from us, but we look at free trade as undeniably the best agreement that we've ever entered into. Yes, there have been moments in time where we've had irritants. I think within the NAFTA there were dispute resolution clauses to the benefit of lawyers that actually helped. In fact, just as an aside, one of the more startling things that I heard today was that 2/3 of lawyers are going to be out of work. I don't think that has anything to do with the presidential race or NAFTA, but I do believe that certain sectors, there has to be special attention that's paid to, and we've seen the agriculture sector. There was a lot of concern in Canada over the wine industry suffering exponentially as a result of free trade. In fact, it doesn't compare to some of the wine-producing countries, but that industry in Canada has exploded. And so I think when you go back and you fact-check what has actually happened, it completely, pardon the pun, trumps everything that's been said about these trade agreements. They have been exponentially beneficial to all of the participant nations, and I think the same will play out over time, whether it's our CETA agreement or whether it's TPP. But you just have to continually inject facts and truth into the discussion and call out the rhetoric whenever possible. And in today's modern interconnected communication world, there's greater ability to do that than ever before, but the problem sometimes is that there's so much white noise that the average working person can't pierce through all of the incredible information that is now available at a person's fingertips. So I still have a lot of faith in people making the right decision. At the end of the day, we will never try to influence outcomes in something as important as the Democratic presidential race in the United States, but we're watching very interestingly. I can tell you that in our own election that took place just 7 months ago, in the middle of that campaign, there was a poll done, and there were more Canadians watching the presidential race than watching the actual election that was happening in our own country. That's how dialed in Canadians have been to what's happening in this race in the U.S.
Peter, just one last comment. I think that the fact that the middle class in Mexico is growing is a testament to the above. And to the extent that we have a larger middle class, it's more consumption for U.S. products.
So you guys dissect for me. I mean, somebody in the last panel said, if the U.S. isn't for free trade, we're really in trouble, because the U.S. has been the motor of engaging the world on free trade. What happened to the support for free trade in the United States? I mean, it wasn't a monolith ever, but there certainly was a consensus that free trade was generally a good thing for us, that the ability to interchange with partners and friends and commercial partners is a good thing.
Well,
what happened to that?
I think in my party, for various reasons, the base essentially has come to a conclusion that's anti-free trade. There's labor, as all of you probably know, the labor movement has suffered a number of hits. I live in the state of Wisconsin, where we had a governor that just declared war on the unions. And as the labor unions are trying to sort of reconfigure their political strength, they need an issue. And I think they've decided that for their workers, in terms of jobs, in terms of income, and then joined by environmental groups who also have raised certain questions and doubts. You have essentially the base of the Democratic Party, and Bernie Sanders reflecting that base, and Hillary Clinton sort of moving with the wind toward that base for her own reasons, that essentially has decided that trade is no good, and doesn't believe that the TPP is particularly going to be beneficial. The party that normally would have the stronger element of free trade, I'll defer to Glenn, but from my observation, it has a semi-hostile takeover by somebody who doesn't believe in that issue. And that of all the things that he and Paul Ryan disagree with on, that may be one of the most fundamental, and I'm not sure how they ever are going to square that circle. So you have a weird confluence of there is no political base right now for TPP or for trade that it's essentially going to act in any major way between now and November.
The heartland of America feels like it has been hollowed out economically by trade and globalization. So what they felt they were promised, which this would lead to more jobs, more opportunity, has proven not to be the case. Now, it certainly has helped the coasts. You know, you look at what's called the Acela corridor. That's Washington to Boston. That area is doing great. The Pacific Coast is, California, Oregon, Seattle. Those areas are doing well financially. Another factor is there has been a significant shift to the Republican Party among non-college educated white males. They used to be the heart of the union workforce and the union support. Now they are the strongest subgroup for Republicans, and they're also the strongest supporters of Donald Trump. So he's listening, he's hearing where his base is. And you contrast that with Hillary compared to Bernie Sanders. Hillary, she was scarred obviously by losing in 2008 and vowed, I'm not going to get caught by surprise like that again. So when she has seen the Democrats moving into the anti-trade camp, she is running as fast as she can to get over and say, I'm the leader of this movement too. It's not that credible particularly, but she's doing what she needs to do. Now, I've already heard it expressed this morning that, it doesn't matter, once she's elected, she'll totally say, I didn't mean that, and change. I don't know. I don't know that there's anybody of the three candidates who are left who is going to govern as a free trader.
Let me move to another issue in the U.S. elections. Raimundo talked about sort of the concern of the Mexican business community, and clearly here in Mexico there's been a lot of talk about Donald Trump. And one of the things that people say is that the Latino vote in the United States is growing by leaps and bounds all the time. 56 million Hispanic Americans. I don't know how many voters there are among those, but I'm sure you have the number. But will the Latino vote save Hillary? And if it does, what does it mean for the Republican? What does it mean for the relationship between the Republican Party and Latinos?
So what were the operative words here? Quote, the Hispanics love me. No, they don't. And I would be shocked. Listen, I've been surprised, and I say this tongue somewhat in cheek, but with Trump, he is unpredictable. That is his foreign policy doctrine, we now know. The Trump doctrine is unpredictability, so almost anything's possible. But I would be very surprised if states like Nevada and Colorado which have been very much part of the battleground set of states that have decided American elections in recent years, would remain in the Trump calculus. Most of the talk, Florida probably will because he has a second home there and it's just too big to ignore. And as we all know, it's a complicated Latino population in Florida. A Cuban, which I know we're going to have a later panel on, but a Cuban population was actually changing in its views, and then a non-Cuban population, which is more reflective of the rest of the country. But he's not going to go for Nevada or Colorado. He's making a big play, we presume, for states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, as I said, where I live, and to try to sort of transform this white working class appeal into an assault on normal Democratic votes. But I would just point out that one of the aspects of the demographic trends in America is that the Latino vote in all of those states has grown and has become more important over time. New Jersey is another example where Trump thinks he can have appeal because of his New York base. So that it is certainly possible that if there is an enhanced Latino turnout, I think that's very likely. Whatever happens to the rest of turnout in the U.S., I think the Latino turnout is clearly going to be up, even more than just the general demographic trends. And if that vote, Mitt Romney got 27% of the Latino vote, let's just say for argument's sake that Trump's vote is downgraded to maybe 20%, under 25%, that could end up becoming not only impossible for Trump to win in Nevada or Colorado and maybe doom him in Florida, but also, this is the best case now for the Democrats, also might still stand in the way in these states where he seems to be making the Faustian bargain of giving up the Latino vote in exchange for the gain in the white working class vote. So the Latinos are a critical part of this American electorate for years to come, decades to come, but also could become a critical part of November.
Well, I think when you look at demographics, there's one clear conclusion, and that is that my party, the Republican Party, is bad at math. Because when you look at the 2012 election, Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote. He won 56% of white women. And that was not enough for him to win. He still lost by a significant margin overall. There's just not enough. The share of white vote is declining significantly. It's down to 70% in 2012. It'll be below 70% in 2016, later this year. There's no question about it. When Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter in 1980, if he had gotten those same percentages based on the 2012 electorate, he would have lost, and he won a landslide. That just shows you how much America has changed in the last 36 years. So for Republicans to be satisfied with 27% or less of the Hispanic vote is mind-boggling. It's just stupid. And, you know, we have a difficult time cracking into African-American vote. They vote 90% plus for Democrats. Don't get enough of the white vote to win, particularly since Donald Trump's controversial comments about women as well as Latinos. The groups that we need to improve with are groups that he's making it more difficult for us to improve with. So there's no question that Latinos are going to be extraordinarily important this November and going forward.
Just one quick follow-up and maybe a little bit of an olive branch to Glenn's party here that I don't necessarily think they're totally doomed. We did a study recently in Colorado of millennial Latinos. Now, if you want to talk about growth, that's now double down in terms of a growing ascendant part of the American electorate to be under 35 and also Latino. What's interesting is that they do not perceive their own futures or their self-interest in terms of the issue of immigration. Now, Trump may, in the short term, have done in the Republican Party in terms of this election, but they are increasingly essentially voicing that it's their own economic futures, their own ability to feed their family, to get a good education, to pay for an education, to get a job, much more than what's happening on the immigration front, which has been a problem for your party and your policies toward immigration. But there's still a historical opening here for the Republicans to talk about the economy and people's own financial future that we may be in a panel 4 or 8 years from now and say, remember those days when the Democrats would win 75% of the Latino vote? The flip side is my own state of California is an example where the Pyrrhic victory of one particular ballot measure, Proposition 187, pushed by then Governor Pete Wilson, which essentially denied benefits to immigrants, you all know about it, was a Pyrrhic victory of an epic scale that in fact did set into motion a political reaction that has now produced an overwhelming and growing strong Democratic vote among Latinos in California that's helped make California just a dominant Democratic state. If that is the future of what Trump and the Republican Party has done, then we will be the benefit. But if it shifts to a different ground that is not simply an argument about immigration, but an argument about people's financial future, then we could have a much more competitive, environment in terms of the Latino vote.
Peter McKay, you wanted to jump
Peter,
in?
I just want to jump in with a sort of, a comment as a recovering politician and somebody who's still close to the craft. I mean, I have to marvel at the approach that's been taken in offending, like personally offending
Everybody.
large swaths of the electorate. And then the additional phenomenon of going after the media as aggressively as he has. In Canada, that is political suicide, to take on the mainstream press as aggressively as he has. But the immigration issue has always been, I think, anathema for years in every country. In Mexico, I'm sure it's the same. If you start promoting anti-immigration, this is the sword of Damocles. You know, this is going to impact and cut in so many different directions. You mentioned in the opening, Peter, that we just accepted 25,000 Syrian refugees, which extended a lot of goodwill in the world. And we're a country, you know, that has 35 million people. The secretary or somebody earlier referenced that there are 35 million Mexican Americans. That's our entire population. And so immigration is very much a part of the future growth of Canada, and any government, previous governments, future governments in Canada, are going to have to fully embrace immigration. But to have somebody talking about not just anti-immigration, but specifically saying we're going to ban Muslims, that sort of signals an intolerance, again, that it has not been part of the political discussion that I can recall in my lifetime. And the branding exercise, the damage of brand that it can do to the Republican Party also goes farther. And you know, I don't say this as a hectoring note, but I mean, I would worry as an American that kind of signal going out to the world about Muslims or anybody else for that matter as not being welcome. That doesn't help with the broader world's problems right now of tolerance, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's what we saw happening, you know, in countries like Afghanistan, even those within our own region here within the Americas. It's a very dangerous tone to take at any time, and it's reminiscent of some of the worst and darkest periods in world history.
Raimundo, let me force you, given what Peter just said, let me force you into a moment of discomfort about worst case scenarios. I mean, there has been, you know, the Mexican-American community in Mexico itself has been singled out for really serious, what I think Peter called insulting behavior. And is it possible, should this continue, and that there's, if Mr. Trump would win, that there would be a backlash in Mexico which would want to reduce relations with the United States, which would want to seek to boycott the United States in some issues, which would seek to somehow not want American tourists anymore? I mean, what would be the reaction here in Mexico?
I don't see that, to be very honest, because it would not benefit either of the two parties. To me, globalization really doesn't recognize geographical borders the same way that politicians do in certain ways. Precisely, foreign trade and free trade and the policies that both countries, along with many others, certainly Canada, Mexico, the United States, have adopted, is founded on the premises of the competitive advantages of each of the countries. And that has resulted in value-added supply chains that I don't see how, by just artificially closing the borders, would benefit anybody. And just by a missing link there will disrupt everybody. So I really don't think, I'm hopeful that the level of discussion once it reaches the next level, and certainly whoever becomes the next president will come to a better sense.
Could I just add that the leadership at various times in world history doesn't always speak for the people. And I think, and I'm not drawing any comparisons whatsoever to the United States and the country I'm about to mention, but Iran, the regime in Iran does not speak for the Persian people. I suggest strongly that the Syrian leadership does not speak for the Syrian people. And so I think that we're in a time where there's certainly a great deal of sophistication and understanding about national relationships. And I agree very much that we're going to get beyond this, period. It's a moment in time, what the Germans call an Augenblick, and it's going to pass. And the relationships are far deeper, our countries are far more integrated in North America, or South Canada, as we like to call it, that, that we're going to get beyond this period of time.
That's what they think of in those cold winters, you know. We're in South Canada, that's what they are.
Yeah, they call it
So
Florida.
we're going to keep trading with the United States and with Mexico. We're going to keep coming down to Mexico in the winter for sure. And the relationships are going to survive and endure and flourish, I think, and become even more integrated through time.
I'm going to open it up to questions in a second. I want to just relay an anecdote to Glenn and Paul. I was with somebody in the Clinton campaign the other day who met with a number of foreigners, and all the foreigners were giving the suggestions to this person that said, she needs to be more of a populist. She needs to she needs to be more exciting to people. Why isn't she more exciting to people? And so we talked a lot about Trump. Let's talk a little bit about Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton. I mean, how is she as a candidate? Is it true that she needs to become more populist? What do you see as the road? Glenn, I'm going to put you in this uncomfortable position, but what is the road for Secretary Clinton's success?
Well, she has a couple of huge drawbacks. Number one is she is probably, in my lifetime, the most inauthentic candidate running for president of anybody. And by the way, when you've got to beat Al Gore out for that title, that says a lot. Voters, they don't trust her. They don't think that she tells the truth, that she always shades it to the advantage of herself and her family. And I think I mean, her numbers for trustworthiness, I mean, she should be running away with this election, given Trump's unfavorables being in the mid-60s. And 3 weeks ago, she was up by 10 points nationally. Now it's down to 3-point lead, and Paul referenced the Fox News poll that showed Trump ahead for the first time. Now, when I see that significant a change in polls, I always want to see a second one that says, similar data, that has similar data. So I'm not going to say, wow, things have really changed to the fact that she's behind, but the fact that she's down to, not even including the Fox News poll, down to a 3-point lead, shows you the distrust that Americans have in her. And which, by the way, they do not have that distrust for Bill. Bill Clinton still has very high favorables. People like him still. They see him as a bit of a rogue, but a lovable rogue who did his best as president. How does she win? I think ultimately the billions of dollars that the Democrats have to run negative ads on Trump, there's not a whole lot that she can do to change her persona. She just is who she is. She's not suddenly going to become warm and fuzzy. She's not suddenly going to become a fire-breathing populist. That's not who she is. So I think that you're going to see an overwhelmingly negative campaign, not surprisingly, between the two candidates. And I think that one thing that gets underestimated, people say, well, Trump got attacked in the Republican primaries, but this is a different electorate, a general electorate compared to a primary electorate. So I think that the money that the Democrats are prepared to spend is going to have more significant impact. And she has to wait. Her path to victory is relying on huge margins among Latinos, coming close with white women, turning out African Americans, relying on the traditional electoral college advantage that the Democrats have had over the recent years. And then, just keeping Trump's unfavorables 10 points higher than hers.
That's all well and good, and I don't disagree with what Glenn's saying, but here's the but. In my view, and Trump is the most extreme example of this, when you have a change candidacy, there's always a question of risk. That's part of the territory. Interestingly enough, by the way, female voters are generally more risk averse than men, and they're the ones that usually, George W. Bush won re-election against John Kerry, essentially with women saying, I trust him more on national security than I do this other guy. I think that there is, after all, let's give Hillary Clinton her due. She is extraordinarily versed in the issue. She is extraordinarily experienced. She is extraordinarily intelligent. She has the ability to talk about the world in a coherent fashion that actually makes sense in terms of America and where it ought to be. And shame on her if she can't figure out a way to communicate. I don't want or need her to become a fire-breathing populist. She's already moved somewhat in the Bernie Sanders direction, and that's fine. This is not, I don't think, an ideological election where you move to the left and then to the middle. I think we're way beyond ideology here. She has to show the average American person she gives a damn. She's not sort of cloistered in this Washington establishment world. She has to get out somewhat and show that. But by and large, be who she is, which is extremely bright. She is, after all, about to become the first woman president of the United States, and she actually is the one that has the advantage of skill and knowledge and trust. Ultimately, she should. So part of it is just be calm and carry on, as the Brits would say, and just let this play out. Secondly, don't go in the gutter. Look what happened to Marco Rubio. The minute he tried to fight Trump on Trump's ground, he was obliterated. So frankly, I don't want to see another rally with Hillary Clinton screaming anymore. Get her into a small setting, this big or smaller, and get her to talk to real people in a real way. What's going to be the interesting event, and I still have my doubt about whether turnout really will be as high as we think, but we'll see. But I guarantee you, that first debate will have the largest audience. I mean, not only Canadians are going to be tuning in, but Mexicans and everywhere else in the world. This is going to be theater beyond theater in terms of epic quality. But how she handles herself, we all know what he's going to do. I mean, he's already made it very clear. He's going to try to take her and drag her into every bit of scandal in her past that he can possibly think of. He will have not a more than a millisecond of trying to be above it all. And she has to be very adroit at how she is strong and forceful to that, but not sink to the level. If she's able to sort of achieve that from a sheer forensic standpoint as a candidate, then I think her virtues start to come to the fore, and then we may be talking about a different election when we get to the middle or the end of October.
Let me ask you all your turn to ask questions. Why don't we begin with the gentleman here?
More rating than the Super Bowl.
Huge.
Just identify yourself, please.
Armando Ortega from New Gold. A portion of the U.S. electorate appears to be in search of a strong man. And bingo, they found Trump. And it must be seducing because there is a very angry middle class, and you have explained better. And Trump is, among other things, offering them the restoration of some status. My concern is that a strong man, and that has been rightly grasped by Trump, doesn't need coherence. And I don't think media have helped at all. And so he's like a Teflon candidate. Do you think that after he gets the Republican ticket, media will do something more serious in terms of finding out all his inconsistencies? For example, I just read yesterday that The Guardian found that he has investments in Orion, in one of the holding company of Orion. He has criticized Orion for transferring facilities to Mexico, and also in Carrier, in the holding of Carrier. He has made money.
Great.
But who cares? So the point is, this would be addressed to Paul or Glenn. Is there going to be more scrutiny? Can we expect more scrutiny so that the U.S. voter can have a better opportunity to really reflect more upon all these statements and crazy ideas of Trump?
Thank you. First observation is when you say he's the Teflon candidate, that's not true. He wouldn't have 65% negatives if the stuff just rolled off of him. So things are sticking to him. People don't like him. Okay, number one. Number two is he's undergoing massive scrutiny by the media. The Washington Post has 20 people off, and their only role is to investigate his background. Secondly, there have been tons of articles, tons of editorials exposing, his flip-flops and things that he said that don't jive with his background and his, what he's actually done in his life. There's been tons of that. But the voters who support him, and again, it remains to be seen how large that group will end up being at the end, they don't care. They're tired of professional, slick politicians. They're tired of being told that, and no disrespect to my colleagues up here, but that the trade deals that are benefiting Canada and Mexico so much and hurting the U.S., well, we should go with that because it's good for the world. It's not good for you and your job. It's not good for you and your family, but you don't matter. They're tired of hearing that. So that's why they don't care about Trump's inconsistencies, for example. They're used to that from all politicians. Again, I'm not defending him as a strong man. As you can tell, I'm not a fan of his. But to say that he's gotten an easy ride from the media just is not true. He's just been able to kind of bat it down quite a bit.
He's ahead in the latest poll. I mean, that's Fox News or not. The fact that it's even close right now gets to your question. And I would say from here on out, my simple answer to your question is, of course, there's going to be tremendous scrutiny. But it's also up to my side to figure out how to try. I mean, this is never just a game that's not being played without other actors, what to emphasize and where to go. What worries me a little bit is I don't think it's news to anybody in America, whether they knew the facts or not, that Donald Trump has been at best, a heel, an ass to women in his background. That's sort of what I expect. How many wives are? I mean, that's the man that we would expect to see. I don't think it's news to anybody that he's figured out some way to deal real estate and other business deals that have ended up benefiting him financially. That's not going to be any shock to anyone either. They'll tend to disregard it. What is a story and what will have some value here is how he's treated his own employees, how he's treated other workers, what has been the actual effect of some of the things that he's chosen to do in his life on a broader part of the electorate. Does that start to tell working or middle-class Americans, wait a minute, it's not just that he has an ego, it's not just that he's sexist, it's not just that he's in love with his own name and his brand, but I get screwed by this guy. I get hurt by this guy. I don't trust him, and that's the scrutiny that I think might open up some degree of vulnerability that perhaps is being somewhat obscured right now. The personality of Donald Trump, he's winning. I mean, he's flat out winning. I don't care, Glenn, what the negatives are. He has stolen a Republican Party nomination away from everybody that thought it would go to Bush or Rubio or whomever, Ted Cruz even, in the light of day. It's the greatest heist that we've ever seen politically that I'm aware of. And I think we have to acknowledge that maybe he understands media politics and communication better than a lot of the rest of us.
Question. I'll come back to you in a second, just changing sides.
Well, my name is Maria Teresa Fernandez, and I am the president of Emprevasc and the delegate of Mondragón Corporación, which is a group of cooperatives from Spain. I am quite interested about the figure of the vice president. Who do you think that it will be the vice president in the Democratic and the Republican Party? And I congratulate this conference because it's great, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Want me to go first? Okay, so I'll do the Democratic side. There is a dictum in politics, and increasingly it's come to apply to the vice presidential choice of sort of the old Hippocratic oath of do no harm. And the cautious person, and I think there's an element of caution in Hillary Clinton that we shouldn't discount, would say, get someone who doesn't hurt me, Maybe there's a benefit if it's a Tim Kaine or a Mark Warner from Virginia, an interesting state, or a Sherrod Brown as the senator from Ohio, another important state. Early on, there was talk she would go with a Latino candidate. I think that's out the window right now because it's not necessary. The Latino vote's there. You don't need to put Julian Castro or somebody on the ballot. I have a theory that if the Clinton campaign and Hillary herself comes to believe this is a more existential threat that's happening to her campaign now in the form of Donald Trump, there are actually two game-changing moves that she could make. One probably won't happen, the second one, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. But the one that I think is actually something to take seriously is to go with Elizabeth Warren. And for two reasons. Number one, there is a serious Bernie Sanders problem. And I don't think those people who say, well, look at the past, all these voters, they'll come back to the fold. That's what always happens. This is something very different. When you had the incident in Nevada with chairs being thrown at a hotel this past weekend, you have Sanders voters pledging online. They're almost taking a blood oath here that they are not going to ever vote for Hillary Clinton. They don't care what happens. With the sense that this is a rigged system that her money and the Democratic Party establishment is controlling and goes to the heart of his message. That message is being denied, does create a bigger potential problem of disaffection and Sanders voters not voting for her or not voting at all. And I think Warren is the best, not the perfect one, but the best mechanism. And it doubles down on gender. It basically says, all right, Trump, you want to essentially go down this road of misogyny, and he said, after all, it's his quote, not mine, 3 weeks ago, where he said, if she weren't a woman, she wouldn't be getting 5% of the vote. That's his words. That going with Elizabeth Warren essentially, just as her husband doubled down on generation with Al Gore, she'd be doubling down on gender in a way that might make, Glenn's going to have a response here in a minute to this, but might make it really difficult. The other move would be, and she won't do this, but just for the heck of it, let's get somebody experienced who the country could trust, that if anything ever happened to me, he's already been there, he's been close to power. Put Joe Biden back in as vice president. Nothing in the Constitution says you can't do it. And that'd be, I mean, we'll talk about pure entertainment, it would trump whatever the Republican comes up with, so you take that one.
Okay, well, we should go quickly. We have a bunch of other questions, so answer directly.
Predicting what Donald Trump is going to do, what goes on in the mind of Trump, I've been wrong so far this electoral season, so I'm not going to predict a specific person. I think that he's more likely than not to pick a woman, though, because obviously he's had a number of self-inflicted wounds on that, and I think they recognize that.
Great. Amy?
Thank you very much. Amy Glover, McClarty Associates. This has been a very interesting discussion. I was wondering if you could offer some more thoughts about what the Republican establishment might do. You talked about how the middle class in the U.S. feels that they've been left out, but I would suggest that a lot of this is also reactionary. No, this is a hearkening back. We talk about making America great again. It's based on xenophobia, racism, misogyny, which appeals apparently to a lot of people. So how does the Republican Party embrace this in any sophisticated way? What is Paul Ryan going to do? Jeb Bush, I think, took the moral stand of embracing a Trump campaign. What is everybody else going to do?
Look, you're seeing the Republican leadership, the so-called establishment, is having a tough time because in dealing with Trump, in terms of, a lot of them are saying, I support him, but I'm not going to endorse him. Others are saying I endorse him, but I don't support him. So I'm a little confused on what that all means. Secondly, look, elections have consequences, and if Trump gets beaten badly, then he goes away very quickly. If Trump is close, but I think it's a little like Ross Perot in 1992, where the subsequent elections, Perot voters were very important to candidates on both sides, I think in Republican primaries. But also, when you look at Republican primaries so far, there's not been a single establishment candidate defeated who is running for renomination. So while they're kind of going for Trump, they're not automatically going for people who are trying to sound like Trump or be like Trump, or those who are saying this incumbent is too moderate. So it is not something that is affecting or infecting congressional and Senate and gubernatorial races.
Jose Carreño here in the front row. Coming.
It's coming.
Coming this way.
Jose Carreño with the Mexican newspaper Excelsior. I'm wondering if everyone here might be a bit optimistic about the perspectives of Mrs. Clinton. However, my question would be if the Democrats, divided as they are or they appear to be, might be able to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
We've done it before. Listen, if this were Barack Obama running for a third term, not constitutionally allowed, but if assume for a second that didn't exist, he would win. If this were a Democrat versus Republican generic race, third term, only one time, George Bush Sr. won in 1988. Other times have been very close elections. Kennedy barely beat Nixon, Carter barely beat Ford, Gore kind of did beat Bush, but oh well.
Wait, I've got a tissue here.
So they've been close elections, and this probably was going to be a close election, but you'd have to say maybe slightly to favor the Republicans because they're the change party. But instead what we have are, if it was a referendum on Donald Trump, he'd lose. If it were a referendum on Hillary Clinton, she'd lose. So it's all and none of those things at once. And I hope I'm conveying the notion that I am not necessarily an optimist right now. I think this is prospectively a very tight election in which the danger, I mean, a month ago I thought Glenn would be up here trying to argue or analyze what's going to happen in the third ballot in Cleveland, because that was the train wreck they were heading to. Now they are, even there's some strains in the establishment, but essentially they are now united. And I have a party where we have a first-time candidate who, the expression of how does Bernie Sanders land the plane, who I'm not even sure he has control of the plane, and secondly, he's never done it before, and I don't think he knows where the airport is, and you could have a serious, I mean, it's funny, but it's not. You could have a serious implosion in the Democratic convention, not in the outcome. Hillary Clinton will be nominated, but in terms of the atmospherics and the way it looks to the country and division in the Democratic Party that's not so easily resolved. And so I am not convinced. I think this is still, I don't know what the trading markets have the race in right now. She's probably a slight favorite, but I don't think she's an overwhelming favorite anymore. So I share your concern.
Peter, one thing I hear a lot is people saying, what if there is another Paris or something in Brussels or something in Canada or a terrorist attack? How would that affect not only the U.S. election, but how the world sees the U.S. election?
Well, that's a very good question. It's something I ponder a lot as a former defense minister and foreign secretary.
Which is why I asked you.
And there's one candidate, and we all know who it is, who has said, well, maybe America should look at pulling out of NATO, because those other countries are not really carrying their load. That's a legitimate commentary, but it's the pull out of NATO part that worries me in the extreme. And while other countries may not put the same amount of their GDP into their national defense, they're contributing mightily. I mean, I have to come to the defense of Canada and say, you know, we lost almost 160 lives in Afghanistan. We were taking per capita the highest casualty rates of any country in that theater. And, I'm in Mexico, so I'm safe to say this, we're not in the US. We were in the First World War 2 years before the Americans, and in the Second World War 3 years before the Americans. So Canada, I can take you to the grave sites of 110,000 Canadians who are buried on the continent of Europe. We're very conscious of security. We are concerned about ISIS, as we were about Taliban and Al-Qaeda. These elements are not going away, and yet the discussion around security has, interestingly, not been prominent to the same degree that I would have expected, given, from a media perspective, given from a public consciousness of terrorism. That has not been the prominent part of the debate in the United States, for a change, frankly. How would either of these candidates react? Certainly, Hillary Clinton has far more experience, by a mile. And yet she also has far more baggage. Benghazi, all of the discussions around how she handled certain files. And I completely agree that a change election is an overwhelming riptide for somebody in the Democratic Party, because they have to carry the baggage of everything, good and bad, that your predecessor did when you were part of that administration. And it's the same throughout the world. Even if you're a new candidate, if you were part of that former administration, you're answerable. Donald Trump's sort of, ramblings and rantings about foreign policy are not only worrisome, they're off-putting for some of those important institutions that have preserved stability, that are the best defense that we have. UN's not perfect, NATO's not perfect, but as Churchill said about democracy, it's better than, all the others. It's better than all the alternatives. And so I'm hopeful that as we get into the actual presidential race, there will be some return to sanity and some focus on the security issue as part of the dialogue, because it's not going away, and the world is as dangerous today as it's ever been, and the internet has been a huge enabler in that regard, in terms of recruiting, in terms of sharing of information. Young people are now far more attuned to that social media as a way that they're informing themselves. That has also not been fully harnessed by the political class, but it has been by groups like ISIS. They're benefiting exponentially from getting their slick message out. I mean, what could possibly motivate a young Mexican, Canadian, or American to go off almost to certain death and take part in nihilism, which is what ISIS stands for?
And without casting judgment on this, it was true this morning. I don't know when he woke up, might have been at 3 o'clock, but the first major American political figure to tweet about the crash of the Egyptian plane into the Mediterranean was Donald Trump. He didn't hesitate. He said, this is obviously a terrorist act. We have to be stronger and more vigilant. There he is.
I've run out of time, so thank you very much, and in particular, thank you to my panelists, Raimundo, Peter, Paul, Glenn. Thank you very much for a really engaging dialogue.
Good, Peter. Man.
We're just going to change venues here, and
Thank you very much.
the Cuba panel will be right up.